Good morning, Grand Point. Merry Christmas to you. Welcome into the house. So I was greeting some people in the lobby today, greeted some kids and said, Merry Christmas. This one little girl emphatically corrected me and said, it's not Christmas yet. So it is not, but it doesn't, this is Christmas Sunday, right? And the Sunday before. So welcome into the house here today. My name is Lawrence, one of the pastors here. I'm not preaching today. I'll introduce our guest speaker in just a moment and kind of let you know how all that came to be. But before we do that, I have a few announcements. Next Sunday, we are not going to be meeting in person. That is December 26th, the day after Christmas. And the reason for that is we're giving our staff a break. Our staff puts a lot into the Christmas Eve services, and we're going to give our staff a break, give you an opportunity just to stay home, gather with your family, maybe have some friends over for some time of worship. What we are going to do is produce a short message for you. It's about a 30-minute message, including some song and a message from all three pastors. And we encourage you to listen into that as we bring you our Christmas greetings on that Sunday as well. Now, before that, I want to give you a personal invitation to the Christmas Eve services on Friday. Friday at 3, 5, 7, and 11. There'll be services right here in the sanctuary. Let me just kind of brief you on the nature of those. The 3 o'clock service and the 11 o'clock service will be identical, in that it will be, the band will not be here. It will just be led by our 8:15 team. And we will also have a time of communion and candle lighting at both of those services as we close. Now, the 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock services are more family oriented. That will be led by the live band and a choir. Did you know there's a choir? So we're hoping to have about a 30-member choir for Christmas Eve. Now, let me just put this out there because that choir is not yet put together. So here's the thing. Right now, we have about half. We have about half of that. We have about 15 people for the choir, but we would love to have 15 more. If you would love to sing in the Christmas Eve choir and are available for a rehearsal on Wednesday evening and available for the 5 and 7, at least for that portion, you stop by the hub today, sign up. We need 15 more people for that choir. And we know that you can be there. When Chris was telling me about this, I said, so what are the requirements? Do you have to be able to sing? He said, preferably you should be able to sing. So this is not just a joyful noise kind of a plea, right? Everybody can do that, but hopefully you can carry a tune and sing. If you can't carry a tune, we might place you somewhere on the stage that you just aren't heard very well, but you're going to be part of that choir. But we'd love for you to do that. It's going to be an awesome evening. We're expecting full house and just the place is going to be crazy. So we encourage you to come out for that as well. One more thing before we have Chad come and speak to us. We have been having this Christmas giving tree in the lobby, and I just want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for your response to that. You have outdone it, right? We have put labels on there and gift ideas for you to buy for our community partners, and you have gone over and above. Thank you so much for blessing these community partners with that. For those of you who are not aware, we have 5 partners within our community: Noah's House and Gracie's Place, a transition house, and we have Network Ministries that serves our youth. We have Monarch's Way, which again serves young ladies coming through transition periods in their life. We have a ministry called She's Somebody's Daughter, which helps women in sex traffic industry. And I'm missing one, and Camp Joyelle. I think I messed up on that one last week as well. Camp Joyelle. So here's what I did in the first service. I put that one first so I wouldn't forget, but didn't this one. So Camp Joyelle, serving this community and its children for many, many years. And what we're going to do on Christmas Eve is we're going to take an offering. Again, it's one collection for all of these ministry partners. And we encourage you to give as just God lays in your heart. Some of you may give online. Tomorrow morning, the online giving will be open for that as well. And so we encourage you just to be a part of that generosity. But I want to thank you again on behalf of all these community ministries. Thank you in advance for your gifts and your support of them. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker this morning. You may have noticed, did you notice who our drummer was today? Yeah, we had to put him in the cage. And some of the worship team members are saying, I think we're going to put him there a little bit more often because he doesn't talk quite as much in there. But we just had a lot of sickness in our team. You know how this is going around, and we had several staff members out. So we didn't have a drummer today. Chris, our worship leader, stepped back in there. Ryan graciously stepped in to lead some of the worship, and so we love how our team just accommodates that. Also, Doug Coldsmith. Doug, if you're watching online, welcome into our service today. We're missing you, but Doug is still in quarantine from some sickness that he had. He was scheduled to preach. And Doug, we're going to get you back some other time, but we just appreciate Chad, our executive pastor, being willing to step in. Some of you may wonder, what does an executive pastor do in a church? Sounds like kind of a boss, doesn't it? He's the boss. Right? He's the guy that kind of tells the rest of us what to do, keeps everything together. And I want you to join me today in just welcoming Chad Chute, our executive pastor, as our guest speaker today. Thank you, Chad.
Hey, I am thrilled to be with you this morning. I had the opportunity just to dive in together in this series, The Family Tree. You know, it's been great to walk around during the week, and this week as I was preparing, I kind of was walking through the building thinking about what I'm going to say, some concepts that were kind of going through my mind, and I was walking through the lobby and I stopped and looked at the tree. And can I tell you, all of you look pretty good, or let me say at least most of you look pretty good from your pictures. No, it's great to see how God has blessed our church family. And as I look at that tree, I realize God has brought just the people that we need to help us fulfill the gospel mission of Christ for this season, and that's you. You know, as I began to think about that, I realized that the same is true for Matthew chapter 1, this family tree that we've been looking at, kind of the lineage of Jesus, that at just the right time, each one was placed there in order to fill the redemptive promises of God's unfolding story. You know, as we've gone through this series, I've realized more and more how important it is to celebrate Christmas. You know, my family laughs at me because I'm not a huge Christmas person. You know, I put up the tree and it's like, okay, let's move through it. And when I was growing up in a pastor's home, every year the Christmas story, you know, you kind of went through Sunday school and did all that. And it was the same story every year. But this year, through this study of the line of Christ, you know, it's just reignited within me that passion for the Christmas story. That first week, we kind of looked at the humanity within this story and the concept that I'm not sure I ever grasped before, that Jesus didn't come just to show us how to live, but to show us the power and what he could do in each of our lives. And last week, we looked at the sovereignty of God. And I would challenge you, if you ever struggle with God's sovereignty and his control and his purposes in this life, mark that message on your favorites playlist and just go back to it every once in a while, because it gives us a great perspective on life as we live it. And as I began to prepare for the message this week, I began to realize that throughout Matthew chapter 1 and all those names, it gave me an unbelievable comfort in the promises that God gives. It gave me an unbelievable confidence that those things that he's promised are and will come true in our lives. And as I began to dwell on that and look at that this week, my mind quickly ran to ideas of the family tree. For years and years and years, family trees or family stories were passed down through storytelling. You know, I can remember as a kid, I would go to my grandpa's house and he would tell stories about him and his brothers and them playing on the farm and messing around and going through. And the more I leaned into our family story, the more I became interested in knowing really what is our family about. And as I listened to those stories, there became kind of an overarching narrative of God's goodness and protection on the life of the Chute family. And shortly after Tammy and I got married, I was given a gift that actually hangs in my house to this day. I think it's the longest hanging picture in our house. And it's this. It's a picture of 5 generations of wedding pictures from firstborn Chute sons. And so as I look at this picture, I look and say, hey, you know what? There's my wife and I. And I know what all of you are thinking. One is how beautiful she is. Two is, oh my word, he actually had hair at one point. You know, and so that hangs there, and everybody who walks into our house sees that. But as we begin to walk through, we see generation after generation. It's funny to watch how it changes, because when you go back just, to my great-grandfather, who I had the privilege of knowing, they didn't even wear a wedding dress on that day. They just sat down for a picture, went to the justice of the peace, and it was done. And you go back further, and it's just amazing how life changes. As I began to walk through that, I several years later, I found on my grandpa's bookshelf something that he had invested in. And it was a book that's full of all the Chute ancestors. And it goes all the way back to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Alfred. And it kind of comes up to that point. And as I began reading that, there were periods of time in the Chute history where it's pretty bleak. They were starving in the home country, and they decided that they were going to go to America, and the dad promised that they were going to come to America. Well, in that time, they didn't just come to America. They actually went through Canada, and for generations were in Canada, then came into New York, and then settled in Illinois with Alfred, my great-great-grandfather. This is what I know about family trees. They tell us our history, but they can also give us a hope for the future. Every family tree has great things in it. There are good people in our family trees, in most families. In fact, one thing my grandpa bragged about was that for like 8 generations, we have people who followed Christ in our family. And so he would constantly tell us about that. But as I began to read the Chute history, can I tell you, there are some people in here who I don't know that I like. I have relatives, even currently, that are spending time on your tax dollars in prison. As I think about that, what I realize is that each one of us needs at some point to understand the family tree of Christ. We need to understand what he's done for us and the promises that he gives us and how we can interact with those promises so that we can live a life that pleases him. Within every family, we make promises, don't we? When you were a kid and your dad or mom gave you a promise, did it always come true? No. There were things that were out of the control that couldn't happen. But as a kid, what did I say when my dad told me something and it didn't come true? But Dad, you said. As a parent, I hated that. I hated when my kids said that because it's like, crushing. It's like I couldn't keep my word. Or sometimes it's like, it is coming. You just have to be patient and wait. As human beings, we don't like to wait, do we? My kids last night were all over our house, and they could do nothing but sit in front of the Christmas tree and say, can we open presents yet? And they're 25. But yet there are times where in my own life, I look at some of the promises of God, and I begin to say things like, but God, you said. And as we look at this 42 generation span in Matthew chapter 1, there's some unbelievable promises and things that we can learn from those promises to give us confidence in the promises that God has and is given to each one of us. As we look at this story in Matthew chapter 1 and the stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, it's something that we've heard in each of these messages in this series, is that all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. There was 14 generations there. And from David to the deportation in Babylon, to their exile, there were 14 generations. And from the deportation from Babylon to Christ was another 14 generations. And in every one of those generations, those 14 generation spans, it began and can be noted that there was a promise from God that had yet to be fulfilled. There was something that they were given that they would look at and say, hold on, it hasn't come yet, but I'm placing my hope in that. And this morning, what I would like to do is walk through these three promises that we're given, and then hopefully make some applications on how we can live in confidence because of the certainty that the promises of God will come true. Now, as we begin to start this, we look at the time from Abraham to David. And it began with Abraham, and I want to just kind of tell you a little bit about Abraham in case you may not know the full story. Abraham was living in a land, and he was in his earlier years, and God came to Abraham and said, you know what, I want you to pick up and move to a land I'm going to show you because your seed is going to be numberless. You know what, I want you to go there, and I want you to live. Now, I don't know about you, but when I begin to have a conversation with my family about moving, usually the first question is, where, when, and how are we going to get there? You know, so I can just imagine Abraham going and God saying, I want you to move to a land that I'm going to show you in the future. And Abraham, you know, I can imagine goes home and says, okay, we're going to move. Well, where are we going? Well, I don't know. We're just going to move. You know, for him, there was kind of this uncertainty of, can I trust God in what I'm doing? But the story tells us that Abraham said, you know what? Yes, I'm going to follow God. I'm going to choose to move to a land that God will show him. Now, as time goes on, Abraham was getting older, and there was no sign of any child, or let alone a son, who could make his name great. There was no son who could give him a following that was going to be as huge nation. And I imagine and know that in Abraham's mind, doubt began to arise. You know, he began to say, I'm not sure God's promises are true. And he actually took matters into his own hands and he said, you know what, I'm going to sleep with one of my servants so that I can have a son that can carry on my name. And he took matters into his own hands, not trusting the promise of God. And he really messed up his life. For the next several years, there was division in his household. In fact, after a time, God gave him the promise with his wife, Sarah, and they had a son named Isaac. And Isaac was kind of the apple of Abraham's eye. I'm sure he took Isaac pretty much everywhere with him. In fact, we get a glimpse of one of those stories where they were walking along and God told Abraham, he said, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son and give him back to me. And as Abraham's contemplating this in his mind, I'm sure there were questions like, but God, you promised that there was going to be a great nation. This is my only son. How's this going to work? But Abraham, once again in his life, he said, God, I'm going to choose to obey. And so he took his son and was willing to give him back to God, and God spared the life of his son. But in Genesis chapter 22, there's an incredible promise that he gives to Abraham and his generation. And it says this, by myself, God speaking, I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and I will surely multiply your offsprings as the stars of the heaven and the sands that are on the seashore, and your offering shall possess the gate of his enemies. And then he takes it one step further and he says this, and in your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me and obeyed my voice. Abraham was promised that his family tree would be a blessing to the entire world. You know, when we choose to obey God's command, we also choose to accept the blessings that he gives. As Abraham was approaching the end of his life, there had to be a realization. Because as he approached the end of his life, there was conflict among his family from his son, from his mistress, and his son from his wife, and there was conflict there. And really, it was growing, but he couldn't say that the entire world was blessed at that point. His entire family knew this promise. And for the next 14 generations, they were looking back to the promise that said you would be a blessing to the entire world. You know, I am sure at some point during that line of 14 generations, especially as it moved to the end, and they were talking about, are we going to bless the entire world through our line? I'm sure they began to ask this question: can we trust the promises of God? They had not seen it yet. They had not seen the fruition of God's promise to them. You know, at that point, towards the end of this time, we come up to the generation of David. You know, there was a promise that was given to David. A promise that was given to David and his descendants that continued from David until the time of exile. David's story is that he became the second king in Israel. You know, David followed a guy named Saul, and Saul was the first king of Israel. Israel decided, you know what, we want somebody to be on the throne who we can follow, will help us understand and follow God's commands through the prophets, but can lead our nation. And so God placed Saul in command. And Saul was there, and there's a point in time where it says that God removed his blessing from Saul, and Israel then needed another king. And so what happened was the person who was going to appoint the king went and said, I'm going to go to the house of Jesse because that's where this new king is going to reside. And so he went and looked over all of Jesse's sons, starting from the oldest to the youngest, and he went through and was like, he's not it. You know, nope, that's not it. And he gets to the last one that's in line, and he says, hey, hold on. Isn't there any more sons? And he's like, yeah, we've got, you know, so to speak, the run of the litter that's out in the field. You know, he's the youngest boy. He's way down the tone. And he says, okay, let me see him. And this young son comes up, and God says, this is the one who will receive my blessing. He is the one that will rule my people. And so David assumes the role of king after a season. You know, David saw the blessing of God in his life as he began to take part in the kingdom and followed God's commands. They were able to conquer nations. They were able to see God move in incredible ways. But there came a time in David's life where he chose to rely on his own desires rather than the path of God. We know that story is David and Bathsheba. He chose to fulfill his own desires, and he saw firsthand that failure to follow God results in pain and suffering. You know, there's a statement that I learned when I was young and we tried to teach to other people, and it goes like this. It says, when I choose to sin, I choose to suffer. You know, it's the idea, when I choose not to follow God's path, I also choose the consequences that come as a result of not choosing to follow his way. You know, sometimes those are relational, sometimes those are financial, sometimes those are many different things. But David found that truth to be true. David turned back to God, and as he approached the end of his life, his desire was that his family and his offspring would be blessed, follow hard after God, and have a place where they could worship God for their entire time to come. And David said, I want to build a temple to God where we can come and worship. And God said, David, you're a man of war. You've shed blood. You can't do that, but your son will be able to do that. And David was able to turn over the kingdom to his son. And his son built a temple where they began to worship God. David in 2 Samuel 7:16 received this promise. He said, your house and your kingdom will endure forever. You know what? For a king, there is nothing greater to hear that your legacy and your throne would endure forever. It will forever be in your family. Your throne will be established forever. David was promised that his family tree would forever sit on the throne. But the problem is, the rest of the story is that after David passes away, Solomon takes over. There were some good years for Israel, but all of a sudden, Israel's kings began to be divided. There was a divided country. And eventually, it was led to the point where Israel was taken into captivity and spread across all the then known world. Now, during this time, the stories were passed down about the promise that God had given, that the throne would endure forever. Now, if I'm in the line of David, and I'm approaching this time now of exile, I begin to ask the question, can I trust the promise of God? We're no longer on the throne, and I'm not sure that it will return. Can I trust the promise of God? As we look to the last 14 generations in this line of Christ, it was the time of exile where they were moved in captivity to now the time of Christ. David's family had lost the throne. They were under siege. They were dragged to many places. And they were remembering what had been promised. From their father Abraham, they had promised that their seed would bless the entire world. Yet they find them in a place where they can't even make their own decisions. Their family had been promised that they would reign forever from their father David. Yet they found themselves under siege. And they found themselves as slaves, away from their home and without hope. You know, if we ever look at a hopeless situation, this seems to be it. A God that I trusted in now comes to a place that we question, are his promises true? But in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 31, we see the promise given to the exiles. It says this, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, where I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord." The exiles were promised that God would establish a covenant that cannot be broken, and that they would be restored and rescued. You know, they remained in exile for 14 generations, finding themselves living under the rule of someone else. In fact, at the time of Christ, while they were back in Israel, they were still living in exile under the Roman government. The exiles found themselves moving further and further away from the hope that they have in God. And they asked themselves this question: can we trust in the promises of God? You know, in my own life, there are times where it's difficult or I may have little hope. And if I'm not careful, I can find myself asking the exact same question that 42 generations before Christ had asked: can I trust in the promise of God? But the end of the story is this. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23, after they would have heard that the 14 generations, each one of those generations, they would have remembered that there was a promise from God that is yet to be fulfilled. They would hear these words: "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God is with us. You know, as we look at these 42 generations that looked at these promises, all of a sudden these promises begin to make sense. As the promise to Abraham that the son would become the hope of the world, we see that in Jesus Christ, this one who is Emmanuel, God with us, has now become the hope for the entire world. After Christ's birth, and he chose his disciples, the good news of Jesus Christ that it can only be found in him now spreads to the entire world, where hope can ultimately be found. When we look at the promise that was given to David, this son has and will be forever seated on the throne. What we know is that Jesus Christ is now seated at the right hand of God and will forever be on the throne. That's the whole idea we talked last week about, this idea of sovereignty, even when it doesn't make sense. And to the exiles who he said this, who were looking for freedom from the bondage that they were in, we now realize that Jesus Christ frees us from the ultimate bondage we have, the bondage of sin. You know, as we begin to look at this family tree and we begin to understand it in a greater way, I believe that these promises that we've seen provide hope for our future for this time. As we begin to look at this, the thing that I realize is that we can trust God's promises, that they will come true no matter what. You know, sometimes we want to put a limit on the promises that God gives us. We want to see them within a certain time frame, don't we? It's like, you know what? If God promises me this, I want it now. Don't wait. I want it to come true now. Where the reality of what we see in his promises to each of these is that answer may not come in my lifetime. We can be certain that it's going to come true, but there's not the promise that takes place within my lifetime. Early on in ministry, I struggled with this concept. And I had a pastor who I first served under named Pastor Ron. And he had been at his church 30-something years. And the people there, he incredibly loved and incredibly loved him in a great way. And as I was starting in ministry, there were some rough edges that needed to be knocked off. I know that's hard to believe. I seem so kind and compassionate and all of that. But he knew I needed to understand that the hope that people have is in Christ. And so after I got there was a mother who was diagnosed with cancer and had 2 young kids. And he decided that part of my learning was going to be, I was going to walk with him and this family through this process. So every time he went, I would go with him. And I can remember our church praying for healing and the healing not come in the way that we expected. And I remember just a couple of days before she passed away, I went to the hospital to visit her. And on my way driving the 20, 30 minutes to the hospital from where we're at, I can remember inside wrestling with this concept of, God, why haven't you answered my prayer? Can I really trust the promises that you've given? And as a pastor, I was early on wrestling with that question internally. I knew better than to voice it externally because, I was a pastor and you just don't do that type of stuff. But as I wrestled with that question, I remember getting to the hospital and her family being around the bedside. And, I prayed for them and we were standing around talking and they were telling stories. And at one point, one of the family members asked the question, why didn't God keep his promise and heal her? That's what we prayed for. And I remember her looking out of her bed and looking at her 2 young kids and at her husband and then eventually at the rest of us and said, you know what? I don't want you to ever think that God didn't answer your prayers or keep his promise. Because in just a short time, whether that's tonight or a few days, I will be healed standing in the presence of God. For a young guy, that was an unbelievable teaching moment for me. That God's promises come true. Maybe just not in the time frame or the time that I think. Through his line, we can trust that God's promises will and do come true. The second thing that I believe we can learn is that we can trust that God remains on the throne, even in my most difficult circumstances. As I look at those promises, and as we look at the story in hindsight, we can see that each person was placed there to bring the redemptive, just the right time to bring the redemptive story of Jesus to completion. When we begin to look at that, there were times when Israel was facing uncertain times, and there were times where they couldn't see the end. Kings had passed away, wars were in place, they were in bondage, but yet we see glimpses of what it's like at the throne of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, one of those times when Israel was going to be in upheaval, it says, I saw the Lord seated upon the throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. The glory of God was still in place. He was still on the throne, and he was still sovereign, knowing that Jesus Christ, the hope of the world, was on his way. When I begin to think about that, the hope that I have is even when times seem difficult, even when I face difficult situations in life, I can be confident that God's kingdom is still advancing. I can be confident that God is still on the throne, accomplishing his ultimate purpose of redeeming the world to himself. As I look at this passage, there's one more thing that I believe we can learn. that we can trust that Jesus is still the hope of the world. You know, around Christmas season, we hear that phrase often, that Jesus is the hope of the world. The question that I have to answer is this: do I choose to live that way? As our team comes back up to lead us in one last song, I want us to wrestle individually with that question. Can I trust that Jesus Christ is still the hope of the world? The hope that he brought to the exiles is the hope that he brings to you and me. The hope that we can be free from the bondage that holds us. For some of us, that answer to that question we may make for the first time today. We may choose that the hope he brings is that my life can be transformed to him. As we look at that, I can remember the time in my life where I said, God, I'm going to trust that your way is best. I'm going to choose to put my own ideas aside, and I'm going to choose to follow you. Each one of us has to make that choice. For those of us who have made that choice, we have to answer, how am I going to live with this person of Jesus Christ today? Those places that are difficult, am I going to take matters into my own hands like Abraham and David did at times? Or am I going to choose to continue to believe that the promises of God will come true in his time? The ultimate question is, do we choose to live our way or yield our way to his? And as we leave this morning, I would challenge us. Do we believe that the promises of God are true? Are we willing to patiently wait? And are we willing to allow those to happen in his time and his way? Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for Matthew chapter 1. We thank you for those generations that saw the faithfulness of God, even though they may not have seen it in their lifetime. What we see by the overarching picture is that your promises do come true. And Lord, I pray that we would live and rest in that fact today. Lord, we love you, and we thank you for what you are doing in and through us. And we ask it all in your Son's name. Amen.